Hello, and thank you for joining us at this Track 1.5 Climate Dialogue, organized by the Observer Research Foundation and CEPS together in collaboration, where we're going to be looking at questions about India and EU cooperation on the industry transition in particular. And I'd like to get us started off. I'm Mihir Sharma from ORF. I'd like to get us started off by asking Sepanurmi from the EU mission in India to give us a few brief welcoming remarks.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Dear all, on behalf of the EU delegation to India, I would like to warmly welcome you to this second edition of the EU-India Track 1.5 Climate Dialogue event. The event is part of the EU Climate Diplomacy Weeks. The aim is to have a frank and open discussion on our positions, underlying interests, concerns, and challenges in the area of climate action and the green transition, focusing on the industry transition. The EU Climate Diplomacy Weeks are organized all over the world, always in the running up to the UN Climate Conference, which this year will take place in Egypt. Climate and energy are at the core of the EU's domestic and external policies and are a key priority in our cooperation with India. We are working closely together with the government of India in the area of the clean energy transition, which will be crucial for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, as well as for energy security. We established a detailed working program to implement our 2016 EU-India Clean Energy and Climate Partnership. This covers cooperation on energy efficiency, renewable energy, including solar and offshore wind, green hydrogen, including the annual EU-India Green Hydrogen Forum, which took place for the first time this September, grid integration, sustainable financing, and just energy transition, leaving no one behind. The EU is also very keen on close cooperation within the India-based International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the first focusing on mitigation and the second on adaptation. In addition to the Climate and Energy Partnership, we have a water partnership, a smart and sustainable urbanization partnership, and a resource efficiency initiative, all with links to the climate agenda. The EU has the target to be climate neutral by 2050, and India's target is 2070. To reach these targets, we all need to work together. Industry transition will be an important element of our pathway to neutrality. And no country can tackle alone climate change. Today, we will discuss in an open and frank way how we can further strengthen our already close cooperation. Many thanks to the distinguished speakers and to CEPS and ORF for organizing this. I am very much looking forward to the outcome of your discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, as all of you are aware, the format that we have agreed on for this is that we'll have two very brief introductory remarks from an Indian and a European representative, and then we have an unusually distinguished panel to discuss some of the subjects that we are interested in. And to kick off the initial part of the proceedings, may I invite Dr. Amar Patnaik, who is an MP and also an economist and researcher of some note, including on these issues, to maybe share a couple of his thoughts with us briefly. Dr. Patnaik.
Thank you, Mihir. Thank you so much for organizing this track 1.5 of the dialogue between India and EU on industrial transition. I hope I'm audible. Yeah. So I think this is a very timely discussion, and more importantly, as India committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2070 in COP26, it represents a major challenge for the country in terms of renewable energy installation, and also in terms of the transition, the path of transition. In terms of renewable energy installation, to meet India's 2030 targets, the country must install at least 10.5 megawatt of renewable energy capacity per working hour over the next 9 years, which is equivalent to installing an average French nuclear reactor every 3.5 days. Now, we look at net zero commitment as a net positive commitment because it adds to beneficial for the Indian economy, adds to our economy. And it could boost India's GDP compared to a fossil-based economic scenario. In the case of India, we have to remember, this is something very important, that if India grows in a path of decarbonization, in a path of taking care of climate concerns, and that's what has been presented by the Finance Minister of India in our budget year after year during the last 3 years that I've been in Parliament. It could actually be an illustrative example for other developing countries to follow the Indian path. And I think that's something we must remember. That is why it is very important that developed countries or coalitions like the EU and its member states help India prove that there is a viable way to combat climate change and pursue the development agenda simultaneously by following smart climate paths. The second point which I wanted to make is about the scenario in India. In India, except for the power sector, which is already following a well laid out plan of decarbonization, the industrial sector still faces challenges. There are two challenges. One is the climate finance, the amount of money that is required for this transition to take place, and the technological know-how. Now, on both these counts, I will get into the details later during probably the panel discussion, but on both these counts, the cooperation with the EU is extremely important. At COP26, Prime Minister Modi called for a $1 trillion additional climate finance before 2030 for helping India's energy transition, but also to adapt to climate change. Now, this call is a milestone in global climate policy, but it is also a cruel reminder of the fact that even if India or other developing countries wish to follow a climate transition path, which is non-fossil fuel based, it requires climate finance. It requires adequate money. So it is not just the public sector. It cannot just come from the government's budgets or from the public sector undertakings within the country. It has to come from private sector. And when I talk about private sector, it is not again only the domestic private sector, but it has to come from the global private sector companies. They have to look up to India and work out in various ways, both in terms of partnerships, in terms of technological know-how in a graded manner, to help Indian companies, including the public sector companies, to to follow this path of transition, to decarbonize themselves. Now, I'll give you an example about my state, Orissa. In my state, very recently, we have given go-ahead to the public sector, the central government public sector, Bharat Petroleum, BPCL, which is a oil manufacturing company in India, to explore the possibilities of green energy. And in the private sector, simultaneously, the Jindal Steel Works, JS Green Steel Plant, we have given a go-ahead, and we're facilitating everything possible to make this particular project work. This will be the green steel plant of JSW would be the first in India of such a large scale. So the point is the collaboration. The point which I'm trying to make is the collaboration has to be at all levels. It has to be from government to government, private government, and private means both domestic private sector as well as global private sector companies. The global private sector must look to increase its engagement with both national government and the dynamic state governments. In India, I was in Berlin just the day before yesterday, and in one of the panel discussions, it was said that India is actually not just one country, it is actually 30 countries in there. So each of those countries in India, or rather the states in India, some of them are very dynamic, like my own state, own province. So these private sector could actually do the engagements at the state level itself. I think the institutional structure for it has to be facilitated. With these opening remarks, I would like to end by saying that the possibilities are enormous, but I think the way to move forward is to explore all such possibilities and to move very fast.
Thank you, Dr. Patnaik. I will now turn to Jacob Worksman, who has, maybe for longer than some of us have been even involved in this subject, been principal advisor to the Director General for Climate Action at the European Commission. He's been a fixture for us, something like Queen Elizabeth II. Do go ahead.
Well, thanks very much. Well, I hope I have a few more years ahead of me than she did. But it's an honor to help inaugurate this the second edition of the Track 1.5 dialogue. As others have noted, it's taking place just a few weeks before COP27, and that COP will have one of its main themes, implementation. And I think it's this focus on implementation that will allow us to have a more frank and free exchange than the typical back and forth between India and the EU on raising ambition alone. We have to increasingly turn to deepening our cooperation on implementation of targets as opposed to arguing about just about whether or not our targets are sufficiently ambitious. We're obviously, the EU and India, at very different stages in the development of our economies. But one of the immediate challenges that we share is to decarbonize our means of production without deindustrializing our economies. In other words, the challenge is facing this industrial transition. It's the focus of today's exchange. Over the longer term, we will also face together the challenge of moving to net zero, which I would agree with Dr. Patnaik is an opportunity as well as a challenge. And to do that in such a way that we ensure that we aren't causing emissions to grow elsewhere as we move to net zero within our own economies. For the EU, industry accounts for approximately 20% of our net annual CO2 emissions. By far, the greatest emitters within that are the cement, steel, and chemical sectors. Existing high carbon technologies, therefore, are going to have to be replaced with low carbon technologies. And moreover, the entire system needs to be changed. And so it will require significant investments in the infrastructure, such as clean power, green hydrogen, biomass, and carbon capture and storage, which will be essential to moving heavy industries towards net zero. This will also require new jobs and skills. And that means over the next 5 to 10 years, we need to take advantage of this window of opportunity to really ramp up our investments in both the development of technologies, but also in the skills and the capacity to deploy those technologies. I understand within India's also growing economy, increasing population and urbanization, it's your steel and cement sector, as well as fertilizer and petrochemical industries, which will also grow significantly, and with that, grow their emissions until and unless alternative options are put in place. My understanding is that currently India's industrial sector accounts for roughly a quarter of the GDP share and 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. So as the EU and India move forward with the implementation of our targets, our NDCs, from these very different starting points, I think you can see similar strategic priorities and policy choices already becoming apparent. And the first was already raised by Dr. Patnaik, which is the need for financing this transition, because the costs in these hard to abate sectors are particularly high. We also have to, from the outset, develop and share the technologies necessary to responding to these challenges. And that means cooperation on R&D, but also keeping our markets open to ensure those technologies are flowing in such a way that can really deliver the energy efficiency, the green hydrogen, the advanced biofuels, carbon capture, use and storage, et cetera, that will be necessary. We also share the goal of creating more circular economies in a way that encourages more sustainable production and consumption. And Prime Minister Modi has always emphasized this in every speech I've heard him. And this means increasing our reliance on shorter and more diverse supply chains as well. I think we're both exploring the role of incentives from carbon pricing, but also to product-related standards, to investment taxonomies that can help us to ensure that private investment as well as public investment, as Dr. Patnaik pointed out, drives innovation and creates demand for low carbon production and low carbon products. Finally, there is a need both within the EU and in India to ensure that this transition that we are embarking upon shares the costs and the benefits of decarbonization in a way that is equitable, both within our societies, but also through international cooperation. So in this context, it's been very promising to see that both India and the EU want to lead in the area of industry transition, including through a number of examples, the India-Sweden initiative to launch the Leadership Group for Industry Transition, the International Solar Alliance, which my colleague already mentioned, and also through the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, which the EU launched, and we were very pleased to see India join. And also together, we are testing with partners the potential for just energy transition partners to help speed the transition, in particular, away from coal. Leadership, we've found in the EU on transformation does carry risks, particularly for large industrialized democracies with an active media, robust civil society, and powerful industry interests. And so our efforts at transformation are kind of live experiments that are being carried out in real time. And like all the best laid plans, they're vulnerable to developments outside our control. In 2020, we announced our European Green Deal, which was part of an overall new industrial strategy for Europe that really underlines how innovation, competition, and a strong and well-functioning market and a regulatory framework can increase our global competitiveness through open markets and a level playing field. But since that announcement, we have experienced the shock of COVID and the subsequent economic downturn. And more recently this year, the energy and food crises brought on by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. These crises revealed the interdependence of global value chains, the importance of a globally well-integrated market and a diversified supply chains, but it also illustrated the need for more speed in our transition towards a cleaner and more resilient economic and industrial model. These crises and the EU responses to them also revealed that the European Green Deal were really the best model for a more sustainable, inclusive, resilient, and future-proof recovery. These crises have also led us to double down on our investments in the European Green Deal to secure our energy independence, as well as to help us to stay the course in our fight against dangerous climate change. So the EU commitment to deliver on our 2030 targets and to reach our net zero emissions as they are inscribed in our law, as well as now in the Paris Agreement, remains fully intact. And I want to leave that as my first key message to you as you start this conversation, is that the EU is staying the course. And indeed, we are accelerating our pathway to net zero, and with it, our industrial transformation. We have learned through all this process that we can only tackle this global challenge if we work together bilaterally with our closest and largest partners, including with relevant international organizations. And that, of course, is through deepening partnerships with India. So my second key message is that this industry transition, I think, will become more and more a key part of our cooperation between the EU and India, and that we find ourselves natural partners to take this forward. So I wish you every success with your discussions and most importantly, from the steps that inevitably will follow in terms of that deepening partnership. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And in a short while, we will get to that panel discussion with the panelists who are already on. But before that, I'm going to turn to my colleague Milan Elkbert from CEPS to set the context for us and for our viewers on the subject of the industry transition. Milan, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Mihir. I will just share my screen now and then also take you through a few slides which I have prepared. I hope you can all see and hear everything correctly now. Okay, great. So what I want to talk about in the next 12 minutes is really about the technology background of this challenge. What does it mean for our economies if we want to stay the course of a 1.5 degrees pathway and reach net zero by either mid-century or 1 or 2 decades later? It requires action in all sectors, not just in the power sector, and not just about some improvements in other sectors, but really a massive transformation of transport, of industry, as I already mentioned. And industry, well, in the EU, it's 15% directly, but 25% if we take also all the small sectors. And then if we look at the much wider value chain there, you can even make the case that it's that industry is almost about half of all our emissions. So focusing on industry is already enough to really make the case that we fully need to transform all the economies. It's about hard to abate sectors, and what we mean here is that it's going beyond marginal improvements. So it's not just about optimizing energy efficiency. We have been doing that for some time already, but really about radical new ways of producing energy-intensive goods, so new production processes. And this requires the development and deployment of low-carbon breakthrough technologies, green steel, green chemicals, etc. But there is a cost to be paid for that. Mostly in the sense that we need a whole lot of resources for it, both low carbon electricity and other critical raw materials. For that reason, it is also very important that we limit the amount to the greatest extent possible that we need all these low carbon materials. And that is where the circular economy comes in, so that we can depress that demand a bit and keep everything also within the realms of the feasible. The good news is that all of these low carbon technologies in fact exist already in most sectors, but they are more in a demonstration phase. They have not been deployed yet at scale. We're talking here about green steel making using hydrogen, for example, but also carbon capture and storage applied to industrial processes or things like chemical recycling. So what will need to happen up until 2030 is that we gradually scale them up, also that they become more competitive with the carbon-intensive conventional technologies already out there. And the industries and countries already have a lot of roadmaps for that, showing that it is possible. It's challenging, but possible nevertheless. And we are also putting money on the table to make this happen. But what is important to realize perhaps is that a lot of the money so far is really for the early stage innovation, so for research and development and for demonstration. But what will need to happen over the next 1 or 2 decades is also a very accelerated scale up of all these technologies. And for this, we do not necessarily have the policy framework yet. So we'll need to put in the regulatory and policy conditions so that we can move beyond just the early steps of rolling out these technologies. This is essentially about the value of death, a very well-known concept within innovation economics, and we have gradually moved beyond the first part of this graph. We've done the basic R&D already. Many technologies have been demonstrated, but they remain more expensive. There therefore still is a risk that the technology fails unless they are supported by more policies, more regulations, and also market demand. If we succeed in that, then the technologies will by themselves also become competitive, and we should be able to also scale down then our policy support over time. Another message is that it's really about the value chains. Put some examples on the slide here. It's not just about single technologies and single sectors, but how they relate to each other. And what we have today in the steel and chemical sectors may not necessarily be what we'll need in the future. Also because the sources of energy and the raw materials might be in different locations. So it's also about reconfiguring all these value chains. I'd now like to discuss a few examples, just going through some of the key aspects of the technology clusters that will need to be transformed and redeveloped as part of a 1.5 degrees industrial economy. Not just renewable energy, but also the hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and the negative emissions, which will be necessary to deal with those emissions in the economy that will always remain the residual. It won't be much, but it is impossible to fully go to minus 100%. It's the net zero. So on low carbon electricity, this is the sector where we've had the most progress so far. Wind and solar are incredibly cheap compared to 10 and especially 20 years ago. This is good news for everyone. But if we look at the demands of the low carbon economy, it also becomes clear that as we electrify other sectors, such as the heating of homes, but also low and medium temperature heat in industry, that the amount of renewables we need are incredible in scale. So just wind and solar might not be enough. Nuclear energy certainly has a role to play. And in some cases, if there is the demand for dispatchable power that nevertheless does not have emissions, then CCS can still be important. Energy efficiency is also very important, and it also has a role to play in this more transformational logic, which we will be talking about today, because by electrifying industrial processes, mobility, transport, and heating, we also, in a way, are already delivering on a lot of increased energy efficiency, since these processes are intrinsically more efficient. We just need to, change the way we generate the heat and transport services. For this, we also need a whole new set of infrastructure, the charging stations, pipelines for hydrogen, potentially for CO2. On industry itself, then, there are, of course, these technology clusters, which everyone mentions all the time, myself included. But there is a lot of progress possible also within the individual sectors. If you take cement, for example, there are some early stage projects that use radically lower levels of clinker contents, which is where most of the emissions come from. And aluminium has also seen some breakthroughs where most of the process emissions not related to the energy use can be almost fully eliminated. So while hydrogen and carbon capture and storage are really flexible, they come with a lot of demand on either infrastructure or low carbon electricity. We'd like to minimize them, but we should not forget that progress in other technologies is still possible. Beyond these technology clusters, we have the land economy more, and there's also a lot of innovation possible on the bioeconomy side, both for chemicals, certain heavy industry, biogenic feedstocks can play a role. And promisingly, if we combine this with, again, carbon capture and storage, in some cases, we will be able to deliver negative emissions as well. one sort of underlying current here is what will happen to costs. In the case of wind and solar, the picture has been very positive actually so far, because the costs have declined by incredible amounts, and certainly by more than even very respectable agencies such as the IEA predicted 5 or 10 years ago. The question now is, can we do that again for all these other energy intensive industries to also make that much cheaper? For now, it remains more expensive. So for electrolyzers, for carbon capture technology, industrial heat pumps, etc., if we are able to replicate the same cost reductions, then the pathways to 1.5 degrees become much more feasible. There are reasons for optimism. We also see this with batteries, that it is possible if you have enough economies of scale and enough homogeneity of certain technologies and product types, that cost reductions can be realized. But there are also cases where it simply might not be the case. Some industries are so specialized and only have a few production locations in an entire country that you simply will never have the same amount of scale as you would have with wind power or with batteries. So we cannot always depend on this dynamic. Another very important part, of course, is what type of policies do we need to bring this about and to make sure that the low carbon technologies and value chains become dominant and competitive. In the EU, we talk a lot about carbon pricing, but we should not pretend that this is a single fix. We always need to see policies as instruments as part of a much larger toolbox. So carbon pricing is very good at disincentivizing the most carbon intensive products, coal in the electricity sector, but in the future maybe blast furnaces in the steel sector. But it can also play a role in supporting the investment case for the new low carbon technologies. But before that happens, we need industrial and innovation policies to bring down this green premium, the difference between the price of the green technology and the low carbon technology. And market making measures are also very important there. So if policy can create a market specifically for the green goods, then it will become much easier for businesses to invest in this low carbon technology. Then internationally, there are some incipient initiatives, although they are not necessarily always very established. There is talk of carbon or climate clubs and alliances, and the hope here is that they can focus a lot more on the carrots, on technology deployment, on exchange of best practices and technology sharing rather than the sticks. The sticks would be to apply things like the EU's carbon price as part of CBAM. Lead IT has already been mentioned. There's public-private collaboration and cross-sectoral learning. But we should not forget that the UNFCCC also has a technology mechanism, which can hopefully also contribute after the COP of implementation to accelerating the deployment of low-carbon technology. The final thing I'd like to say is that it's not all about technology and not all about cost. Some technologies may not be adopted even once they are cheap, because you have to deal with a lot of local conditions, with permits, with planning processes, and infrastructure constraints. There's also the social acceptance of some technologies. Nuclear energy is one, but also carbon capture and storage is sometimes seen as a not genuine way of reducing emissions. And finally, there's a lot of social implications. There's the question of who pays, both domestically. Will it be the taxpayer directly or indirectly, or are we able to successfully draw in private finance? And globally, the shift between and the burden sharing between the different economies. And then the final point I'd like to make is that as we are talking about the transformation of economies, it is almost inevitable that the geography of industrial production will change considerably, simply because we now need different resources which may be abundant in different places compared to the fossil fuel economy, which is still what our industrial economy is based on. This is something not to be resisted, but rather to be managed. So thank you very much, and back to you, Mihir.
Thank you very much. And after that excellent context setting, which covered, I think, all the ground in industrial on the industrial transition in particular that we wanted to look at, I'm going to now turn to our distinguished panel, which we will introduce one by one as we go along. My co-moderator for this panel is Irina Kostova of CEPS. But I'll kick it off first by asking Mr. Forbes. Naushad Forbes is the co-chairman of Forbes Marshall, and he's somebody very deeply familiar with many of the issues under discussion here. Also, the author of a recent and very good book called The Struggle and the Promise, which I think I should put in a little bit of a plug for, since we're here. Mr. Forbes, thank you for joining us. And I wanted to sort of ask you to give us a sense first of what are the efforts that Indian industry is currently making on the industrial transition. So if you could give us a quick landscape analysis here, I think you're in the best position to do that.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mir. Thank you for the invitation to join you this afternoon. It's a great pleasure, and I enjoyed very much the introductory comments that were made. And I think the comments just now are a wonderful framework for us to use in thinking about these issues of industrial transition. So my perspective actually is of an industrialist, a company. Our company works in the area of process and energy efficiency. We supply energy efficiency products. We supply biomass boilers, and we do energy audits. So we deal with issues of energy conservation and indeed energy transition issues on a pretty constant daily basis. And I will speak from that perspective in a sense, and speak from the perspective of how one can have less demand in industry for energy, and second, how one can source a greater share of total industrial energy from renewable sources. So with those two goals, because I think those two goals are essential pieces in the path to getting to net zero. And I have in mind what Mr. Elkabot just said, that energy efficiency has limits, but it seems to me that it still has lots of potential to run. So let me start there. We did our first systematic benchmarking exercise of industrial energy consumption in 2003 as a company, and we did a very simple exercise where we went around to 5 different industry sectors, and we asked them what their current energy consumption was and what their total output was. And we tried to normalize for variations in the quality of output and to the best that we could. What we found was that the difference between the average firm and the best firm in the industry, in the same industry, was 21%. This is in 2003. And so we set about actually bridging that gap. And we said, if we can make each of the firms, the average firms, if we could get the average to the best, then we would end up with 21% less of energy being consumed. Today, 19 years later, when we've just done, I think, the 4th round of the same benchmarking exercise, which has got more complicated and more with more variables and so on as the years have gone by, which is probably not an entirely good thing, but it's quite a powerful exercise that we do. And what we found now is that the average consumption has dropped between 2003 and 2022, so in about 20 years. It's dropped by, for some industry sectors, by about 20%. For the best industry sectors, by 50%. In other words, the average consumption is down to half what it was 20 years ago. So if you take, for example, the brewing industry in India today consumes about half as much energy per unit of output as it did 20 years ago. The paper industry consumes about 20% less energy today than it did 20 years ago. Now, this, it seems to me, still has many years to run. And I think it's possible to look over the next, if you say 40 some years to meet India's net zero target, and hopefully we can meet it somewhat sooner than 2070, and hopefully sooner and closer to the 2050 that the EU has committed. If we look at that, we could probably look at two more 20, 30, 40% reductions happening in the next 20 years, and then again in the following 20 years. Because energy conservation, we've always found, is something that the more you do, the more you find you can do. Because the last round that we've done of the same benchmarking exercise, we found that the gap between the best and the average firm is again about 20%. So with the average having come down so substantially, there's still more to go at. And the more one does in the area of an organized, systematic energy conservation effort, the more there seems to be potential to do, and you keep finding new opportunities. These are small things, these are incremental things, typical paybacks of 6 months to 2 years at the very longest. The technology in some cases is relatively new, but in many cases, it's not. It's actually old, known solutions that simply need to be diffused and implemented on a widespread basis. And I'm making this point because I think from an industrial transition perspective, energy conservation still has a lot of scope. And if we do benchmarking in a global way, this is the data that we're talking about is Indian data. If we compare best practice internationally, I'm sure we will discover that there are significant differences and significant benefits from following practices that may be current in other countries. So it may be that in some industrial sectors, we have leading firms from an energy consumption perspective in India. It may be that in other sectors, there are great opportunities to learn from what's happening in other firms. And I think a coordinated benchmarking exercise, which is as granular as possible, where one can go sort of product by product and actually share data, and share not only the data of how energy consumption patterns vary, but why they vary. What are the differences in practices between firms? Second, if we talk about renewable potential, what we found in India is that as we've gone around and sold biomass boilers, we found that the ability of the ecosystem to respond to increasing biomass demand has been quite extraordinary. We found that, and it's been extraordinary because farmers see this as a new revenue source, and middlemen, entrepreneurs, see this as an opportunity to do business. So they go to farmers, and when the ecosystem first starts to develop, they simply take away the residue, the shells or the nuts or whatever, for free. As demand grows, farmers find that they can start actually charging a certain amount for this residue to be taken away. And so it starts becoming a residue, it starts becoming a revenue source for the farmer. It grows agricultural incomes. The middleman ends up doing better the more they are able to produce and the wider their geographical coverage. We found that the system has actually evolved very substantially in these last 20 years or so. 20 years ago, it was only the exceptional firm that ran on biomass, generally speaking, only the sugar industry. Today, it's completely common for a Coca-Cola plant or or a Nestle plant or indeed a textile mill in a small textile mill in Surat to run on biomass. This is increasingly a common way of operating. The challenge really is that, if you look at the largest and most progressive firms, many firms we've come across now have set net zero goals of 2030 for themselves. Now, this includes some of the leading multinationals that are operating in the country, but it also includes many leading Indian firms. The challenge is getting that kind of an aggressive target to be adopted by medium-sized firms, by the average typical firm in the country. And I'm going to come back to that point later, because I think while I take the point again about carbon taxes not being a complete universal solution, I think they have a very important role to play in the widespread, effective, and relatively simple diffusion of a much more net zero objective. Let me last come to this point on carbon taxes. In this last 2 years, we've all around the world experienced huge increases in energy prices. We've all seen what's going on in Europe, of course, but the world has seen this in pretty well every country that we operate in. We hear this loud and clear from our customers, that help us with energy savings, because coal prices are up twice in the last 2 years. Oil prices are up twice in the last 2 years. This is true in India, it's true in Indonesia, it's true in Vietnam, it's true in Egypt, it's true everywhere. So what this has led to is that we're seeing interest in energy conservation as never before. Energy conservation has become a topic in boardrooms as it never was earlier. And the argument that I'm making is that it's not just the increase in prices that's important, but it's the fact that the increase has happened with such a shock. The shock has been most helpful, because if the same increase had happened, but it happened gradually over a 3, 4, 5, 10-year period, I think one accommodates to that, and it doesn't focus the mind as the very dramatic increase in prices we've currently seen is with the effect that that's having. So what we've advocated to our customers is that if they want to really put in a good energy conservation program, they could actually consider taxing themselves. So what we've suggested is that they start by taxing themselves 25% of all the costs that they pay for their fuel today. And then a month later, add another 25%. And a month later, add another 25%. And get to a stage where they're paying essentially twice as much for their energy as they currently are. But to do it almost as sort of shock therapy. And in the process, then they can take that money, put it in an account, use it for capital investment, use it for anything they wish. But this then is actually we have a few customers who've taken us up on this, who are actually trying to do this. And the results have been quite remarkable, because the focus, the drive to bring energy consumption down, to move to lower carbon sources has been quite effective. So to very briefly sum up, I think where we can really collaborate very effectively with the EU is in benchmarking. We can look also at some kind of standard setting around renewables and whole of system renewables, which I can talk about later if we have time. And third, if we can do something that's more coordinated around carbon taxes, such that we can agree a certain minimum floor that applies universally, and then certain countries that are moving faster and further in the industry transition maybe increase their carbon taxes earlier than others. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Forbes. Thank you very much for your concise overview and interesting observations and examples. I'm sure other speakers, other panelists would like also to come back to you, maybe to comment on this. Now I would like to turn to Ms. Helen Agren, Director, Minister of Environment, Climate Department, Sweden. Ms. Agren, the leadership group for for industry transition is definitely a success story, and a lot of work has been done. We all know it. We all heard about this. So could you share with us like your view on the role of industrial cooperation, and mostly importantly, how do you see the next steps?
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to join this interesting panel. First, I would like to stress the importance of working across value chains to achieve fossil-free or near-zero products, and perhaps also in even broader systems perspective with the whole ecosystems of stakeholders involved in providing society with the services that we need. And secondly, I would say that it's hugely important to work with public and private partnerships and to provide platforms for dialogue and collaboration between governments and businesses. This is actually a prerequisite to develop the right framework conditions and level playing field for industry on these highly competitive markets, which it is in many cases. And thirdly, I would like to stress the need for a just transition in a global perspective as well as within countries. If industrialized countries are the ones that have benefited from the fossil era and will be the main beneficiaries from the transition, it will not lead us to a sustainable world. So industrial cooperation and public-private partnerships are key to achieve a just transition. So if I could just exemplify with the work of LEAD-IT, the leadership group for industrial transition that was launched at the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit in 2019 by the Prime Ministers of Sweden and India with support of the World Economic Forum. So what was discussed in the industry track at the UN Climate Summit was three main pillars: industry commitments and public-private collaboration, and also innovation. So the leadership group to accelerate transition of heavy industry sectors to low carbon pathways in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. That was the reason why LEAD-IT was formed. So it was actually the first high-level initiative to reach net zero emissions from the hard-to-abate sectors. And it has paved the way by providing technical guidance and political impetus of a host of sectoral initiatives that seek to decarbonize the heavy industry. So the way the LEAD-IT works is to work in develop partnerships for change and to set the international agenda. So this is done by we are arranging leadership summits and statements from this group, and we have currently 19 countries and 18 companies as members of LEAD-IT. And we meet annually or even more frequent at ministerial and CEO level to discuss the important issues to drive the industrial transition. It's about identifying barriers, roadblocks, and to discuss the enabling conditions for innovation and investments in a just energy transition to reach the Paris Agreement. And furthermore, the leadership group works to provide evidence and research to support policy development. So different policy papers have been developed, for example, on green public procurement and financing of the industrial transition. We also support sectoral analysis like the Green Steel Tracker and the Cement Tracker, and as well in tracking industry transition. So these are tools available on the website where you can follow development of roadmaps and implementation plans for different sectors and in different countries. And then the leadership group also works to spur public and private partnership for example, with developing roadmaps. So LEADIT has developed a roadmap planner, which is its guidelines and a methodology to work with the broad stakeholder groups to develop roadmaps for industry transition. So in India, for example, we have worked with the roadmaps for steel and cement. And as we speak, we also plan to support South Africa to develop their roadmaps. So, and when it comes to, for example, setting the international agenda, we can look at, for example, the statements that the ministers and CEOs have signed at the different summits arranged by LEADIT. So in 2020, for example, the statement brought up the issue of making the business case for transition, but also catalyzing demand. And since then, we have seen the launch of other initiatives like the International Deep Decarbonization Initiative led by UNIDO, and also the First Movers Coalition working with private procurement or buyers clubs, for example, to increase demand of green steel. The summit in 2025 brought up the issue on the importance of developing roadmaps and to work with finance principles, but also youth perspectives. So after that, we have also seen the work develop with the roadmaps as I described in India and now developing in South Africa. So this is an important part where you have this platform where businesses and governments meet to actually talk about the issues of greatest importance for transition and to work systematically with developing further actions to remove the roadblocks and to support the industry.
Thank you very much. And I'm now going to turn to Hemant Malia, who is a senior program lead at the Council of Energy, Environment and Water here in New Delhi. And Hemant, I know you're full of ideas on this, and I'm going to ask you to maybe identify a couple of areas that you think will be most productive for collaboration between India and the EU. And I know that you've all been enjoying yourselves tremendously, so you haven't kept an eye on the time. But tragically, that is my role in this entire setup. So let's be brief from now on. And Hemant, I know you are capable of that, so take it away.
Thank you, Mihir, and good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Happy to be on this discussion. So since I have to keep it brief, the filter that I've applied is what is the biggest bang for buck that we can gain from such a partnership, right? And the biggest elephant in the room as far as emissions is concerned is steel. And it's not just because of legacy steel, but also because India has plans to double its steel capacity, right? Almost by 150 million tons per annum capacity. Probably the largest expansion currently, planned globally. And so, this new expansion, if it happens with coal, then we are stuck with coal for another 40 to 50 years at a minimum. So, it's almost not just the biggest, opportunity, but it's, I think, also the most important one. If you're looking at net zero, even by 2070. So definitely green steel is something, and by green steel, I mean steel produced from hydrogen and primary steel, not from, scrap, is something that we want to look at, actively. Europe is the only one which has, a pilot plant on green steel, and so therefore definitely we should consider that as number one priority as far as collaboration is concerned. Number two is CCS in my mind, and I'll tell you why. So we did an exercise on What if we applied every single energy efficiency measure, replaced all of the auxiliary power load with renewable energy, and also did fuel substitution in steel and cement? So this is legacy capacity. Even after you do all of those, you're left with anywhere between 45 to 60% of emissions, which has nowhere to go, meaning there aren't any solutions other than CCUS. And CCU is basically utilizing the carbon after capture and CCS is, storing it underground. If you look at CCU, the challenge there is the products that come out of capture and utilization are much more expensive than conventional fossil fuel-based products, and so therefore finding a market is going to be very, very difficult. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 times the conventional fossil-based pricing. For example, on olefins, or if you take sustainable aviation fuel. So that leaves us, really with CCS as a credible option. Although right now it's not very credible in India because we haven't deployed any CCS here domestically. Having said that, though, we do have significant potential in what we call basalt formations in India. We might probably have one of the few onshore basalt formations that has not been explored, but with the potential to basically sequester all of our excess CO2 that we cannot deal with any other measure for probably 50 to 75 years. So that's a huge potential that needs to be looked at, but we haven't. So clearly an opportunity there. And third one, I'll take the liberty of adding a third one here, and I'll keep it brief. It's not a specific sector, but something that is not being talked about a whole lot is how do we decarbonize high-grade heat, right? And here I mean heat that is more than 120 degrees Celsius. Very difficult to electrify, or it's very inefficient. But there are technologies that we know of in Europe where you go straight from power to high-grade heat with very little energy penalty. And so that's something that needs to be looked at for thermal equipment across board. We literally have hundreds of thousands of those, boilers and furnaces and heaters. How do we, transition them? So that's something that we can look at. So, 3, top ideas from my end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Malia. You spoke about the key cooperation points between Europe and India, and now I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Kirsten Westphal, Executive Director Analysis and Research at H2 Global Foundation. Well, Kirsten, of course, industrial decarbonization is a priority in Europe, in the European Union, and could you maybe give us an overview of the situation of the priorities? And of course, another elephant in the room is hydrogen. I have not heard about this so far in the discussion, but it's viewed as one of the key components for decarbonization, especially of hard-to-abate sectors. So could you give us maybe a bit of overview also on the situation on hydrogen uptake in Europe, and what is India's potential in cooperation on this matter as well? How is it seen from the European side?
Thank you very much, Irina, and thank you very much for having me. And also many thanks for the previous remarks, which I enjoyed very much, I must say, and I tried to connect my 4 points that I would like to make with the points that previous speakers made. First, indeed, I'm working for H2 Global that is directed for a rapid ramp up of green and climate neutral hydrogen and its derivatives. It's an instrument set up by the German government. And it's a public-private platform. And I indeed say, I think I agree with Helen Ogren that this is a very important thing right now to really push forward and to have these platforms in order of getting both companies but governments together to kick off completely new supply, delivery, and value chains. So that's a very a specific challenge we're looking ahead, and we can't let that work simply as in the past, let that organically develop, but we really have to accelerate because speed is of the essence. So what H2 Global tries to do is kick off really supply chains as quickly as possible, and also create the value chains behind, because we're trying to give, a business case by giving long-term contracts to the suppliers and delivery sites, and then sell it into the European market. So we're not just a German instrument, but really a European one, which works with a double-sided tender auction. And I'm emphasizing that because an important point that has also been made is a global market. We have to work on liberalized global markets. I think that is important for both the European Union, but also for India. And in these geoeconomic times, or even geopolitical times we are in, that is not a foregone. The first point I would like to make, because Irina, you asked for, and we are talking about industrial decarbonization of the industry, and this is indeed where I think hydrogen has a major role to play, and not only myself, but of course others are thinking that as well, because coming from a German angle, you know that it's not just the 2050 targets, but in Germany, we have really the target to achieve climate neutrality by 2045. And that's a huge, huge task. And as you know, we built on the decarbonization road for quite some time on the gas bridge. But now with the war of Russia against Ukraine, we realized that the bridge is shorter and more narrow than we thought. And this is why hydrogen is really kicking in, and has to kick in much quicker than we thought, and in also more volumes, and in not only hydrogen, but also derivatives. And this, I'm emphasizing that because we shouldn't see hydrogen just as an element of the energy transformation, but it's really a key for, the industrial decarbonization, but also the revolution that we have to really start. And this, I'm extremely convinced, is a European story, not just a German one. And most of all, it's a story of Europe with strong partners, and at best also a global story, because the IEA has been so clear in its net zero report for 2050. If you remember, they emphasized that we can only meet our targets if we collaborate internationally in a way that we never did in the past. And this is I mean, in the geopolitical situation we are in, very, very difficult to organize that. And this is why we really have to rely on strong partnerships. And that brings me to my second point. I really think that EU and India have a role to play in this decarbonization of the industry, and in kicking off hydrogen and the whole value chains behind, because India, I'm really impressed by the targets and the high ambition. You are also one of the few countries, regions even, of the world where you have these the whole complex value chains in one country, and where India is both a producer and a potential exporter for hydrogen. And that makes it so interesting for the European Union also to work with India, because we also want to produce, but we know that we will be, at least that's my reading, a net importer also in the years to come. And my concrete propositions would be for a work together is really think about establishing a green hydrogen corridor from India into Europe, but also think about setting up, like you said, low carbon value chains together. Think about a clean tech alliance where we can work together, because it's not just as in the past import-export relations, but it's much more. The value chains are highly complex. They are technology driven with sooner upcoming innovation circles. So that's really something to work together, to work on. As Helen also said, organize a just transition where you have a flow of not only the molecules, the products, but also of knowledge, know-how, and technologies. And that's what I mean with really clean tech alliances, low carbon, common low carbon value chains. And of course, I acknowledge that these strategic partnerships are a way forward in this tense geopolitical world, but nevertheless, we should work together on having free working global markets. And that's certainly something for the G7 plus format that has been established, but also for the G20. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I see several excellent buzzy words there, including green hydrogen corridors and low carbon value chains. We've heard a lot of suggestions for what government can do, both incentives, subsidies, creation of common norms, but also carbon taxes and carbon pricing, as Mr. Forbes began the discussion with. I'm going to turn now to Lydia Powell, who is a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, and been studying the energy sector for a very long time. And I'm going to ask her whether she can give us some sense of how ready are we in India, for example, for price versus non-price nudges in enabling this transition? What are the ways in which we can look at the trade-offs there? How ready is industry and the government for it?
Thank you very much, Meher. I'll try to be very brief. In terms of shares of fossil fuels, about half of India's natural gas, about a quarter of coal, and about 1/5 of oil are used in the hard-to-abate sectors. Coal use has a large share in iron and steel and cement production, as was mentioned by the previous speakers. Most of the natural gas is used as feedstock in fertilizer and petrochemicals. Some of the previous speakers mentioned projections based on computerized models for the future of hard-to-abate sectors. In most of the baseline scenarios for 2050, India's energy use increases by more than 2 times, 2.2 times, but it increases 2.6 times in the hard-to-abate sectors. Many scenarios have been studied, and scenarios that emphasize the use of natural gas, increase in resource efficiency, electrification do not change the industrial energy mix significantly by 2050, but the combination of high carbon price and an increase in CCUS do change the energy mix, which is something Dr. Malia mentioned. Does this mean markets and pricing are the solution? What does India's experience tell us? One is the high industrial prices for electricity and how this drove and continues to drive industries towards alternative energy sources, particularly renewable sources. This is something Dr. Forbes talked about, with industry turning to alternatives in the current high energy price scenario. One example is the wind energy industry, which was built on the back of the textile industry in southern India, and the textile industry being very energy intensive. Some of the industries literally abandoned the textile industry and shifted to generation of wind power. Energy efficiency of energy intensive industries like fertilizer and steel are actually comparable to that in developed countries, mainly because of the high price of energy in India. So this means that pricing or markets do work. High energy prices, which can be treated as an implicit carbon price, enabled the shift towards energy efficiency. But mandates also work. I think in the yesterday's discussion, mandates were emphasized. The case of court-mandated shift to natural gas in the transportation sector in Delhi is a very good example. There were some initial challenges, but eventually the transition took place very smoothly, and it's currently very successful in reducing carbon emissions. I would say that India probably abandoned its mixed model of the economy, but a mixed model of markets and mandates is likely to work in India. And India is making progress on both fronts. The Energy Conservation Act has proposed, the recently implemented Energy Conservation Act has proposed introduction of carbon markets for industries, whereas the electric vehicle industry is very heavily dependent on mandates and subsidies. But there are some concerns. India's industrial sector usually involves a long tail of small companies with the technologies of considerable vintage. They cannot adopt modern technologies without some form of financial and other assistance. There are also some social concerns. Just transition was mentioned earlier. Both markets and mandates will exclude or impose costs on the poor. Markets will exclude through price, and mandates probably could socialize the cost of decarbonization and thereby compromise developmental outcomes. This is a concern in a country where per person consumption of energy, steel, cement, aluminum, etc. are well below world averages. The hope is that since most of India's commodity and energy consumption mostly lies in the future, it will allow India to leapfrog into a low carbon future. The main theme of the discussion is cooperation and technology transfer. Financial assistance are the words that are commonly used in such a discussion. But I think technology is rarely transferred and financial assistance is hard to come by. So I would concur with Dr. Forbes' suggestion that the software for change, which EU probably is well experienced in, is shared with India, which will make the hardware transition much easier for India. I will stop here. Thank you.
Right, wonderful. We're almost exactly on time. I just want to thank all of you, first of all, for participating. And this is going to be a very idiosyncratic takeaway. So you will bear with me when I mangle what you have said into my preferred narrative, but that is my job. What I want to, some of the things that I took away is that there is certainly a lot of interest at the government level on both sides. There is also a reasonable amount of interest and potential in terms of large companies getting together. And we have some of the mechanisms in place, such as needed for that cooperation to happen. Dr. Forbes mentioned that at the level of large companies in India, energy prices have played a role in having these causing these conversations at the boardroom level. And there are paths for collaboration. But I also hear that for a true transformative effect in both our economies, we need the kind of economy-wide signal, global value chains that will come from, and I don't know the answer, but from closer collaboration between the medium-sized companies of both jurisdictions, from similar approaches to regulation, similar approaches, not the same, but interoperable is I think the right word. Not identical, but interoperable approaches on issues as diverse as definitions, taxonomies, carbon pricing, minimum pricing, and as Dr. Patnaik has put in the chat box, MRV setting, multiple different ways in which we can reduce the costs to new companies and smaller companies from entering the green and decarbonization transition space. And for me, at least, that has been one of the big takeaways from this discussion. And we need the leadership the large companies and governments are going to provide. But then we'll be able to need to expand that idea to the vast majority of our economies. And so thank you all for participating. And Irina, if you have any last words, just to close us off.
Well, thank you, Mihir. And it's very difficult to step after your very concise conclusion. So maybe I will just say a couple of words. I will list 3 key takeaways, which I personally found very useful and interesting. First of all, of course, private sector is important. And I liked the term global private sector, that its contribution needs to be acknowledged and needs to be streamlined. Global private sector should play an important role. A second point, I liked very much the discussion on value chains and indeed cooperation, even like if we speak about imports of hydrogen or any other energy sources. Well, value chains are becoming important, and the entire trade will differ from the current trade in hydrocarbons. And it's about complexities, it's about technological exchange, it's not about mere trade in the source or energy carrier. And the last point, of course, regulatory frameworks are important. And we heard a lot of discussions today on interoperability. And of course, it's about setting common rules on various issues. And of course, there can be some kind of competition. Of course, we know all these concepts like rule makers and rule takers. And my take rule makers and rule takers. And my key takeaway would be that it would be very beneficial for the European Union and India to be joint rule makers in this exercise. Mihir, I pass the floor to you.
And I will receive it merely to say once again, thank you all for joining us. This was a very productive conversation, I believe, and I hope it's given us all something to take forward. And we will be continuing this conversation after COP, and hopefully there will be new and more optimistic things to say. Thank you all once again for joining us, and thank you, Seps. And
thank you. Bye.
Thank you.